I guess I'll try that again. Hi. Yeah, this might be the second time that I've ever done a talk where I'm sitting like everyone else, but I couldn't stand and type the whole time, and I have this. So yeah, hi. I'm Tiffany Jernigan. If you still, I guess, I don't see anything up. There we go. All right. So if you still use Twitter or X or whatnot, I have my handle up there. And then I have my website, which has a bunch of other talks and things that I've done. If you're hiring for developer advocacy or something like that, let me know. And the QR code that's up on the slides is for, well, these slides, theoretically. I updated it. I guess you can tell me if it doesn't work. So yeah. I guess, again, that's me. But so these slides were created with my friend Jerome Pedizzoni and me. We've done it together previously, but he's obviously not here. He's not invisible. But if you need a bunch of Docker and Kubernetes training, you can go and reach out to him. Okay, so who here has run some sort of local Kubernetes cluster? If you're not raising your hand, I'm guessing that you're not listening. But yeah, basically there's a ton of different options out there. Some of these I actually hadn't heard of before. A lot of people have probably used things like Kind or Minikube. If you're using Mac, maybe you've used OrbStack, etc. But basically there's a ton of different options out there. So who knew that you can use Kind with having multiple nodes within your cluster? Okay, so fewer people. Yeah, I didn't know that beforehand. I thought you could only have just one, but sometimes you want to be able to do things like testing things for node affinity, et cetera, or whether like playing around with daemon sets and whatnot, so that you might want to have multiple nodes. So I already ran this beforehand, but okay, so who has heard of kubectl wait? Okay, so basically if we go over here, and also I'm lazy, so I aliased kubectl2k. I'll type some stuff and then you can all tell me if you're actually able to see it, and we'll kind of go from there. So if I do a qk or kubectl wait on nodes, right now everything will say that it's already up because I already ran it. The reason I didn't go and set up a cluster and start testing this right now is because Kind waits until the very end for everything to be up before you can actually even run this with it. If you're using some sort of other cluster and you're maybe adding or you're adding nodes or things like that and the cluster is already up, this can be pretty useful, especially if you're doing some things with like CI/CD, or you just want to make sure that your nodes are up before you try running anything. So if we just took a look at my nodes, or we can see that we have 4 of them. So yeah. So who has heard of kubectx or kubeNS? Okay, cool, more people. So basically they are command line tools that you can use to be able to do things like switching between Kubernetes context or switching between namespaces to make it easier instead of having to type the whole thing out with kubectl. So if I were to go back over here, if I did like a kubectx, I also have it installed so I can go between the different things, so you can just like go up and down. Not all these clusters exist anymore, but you can basically easily switch between whatever cluster that you're using, which can be pretty useful if you're just wanting to go and switch and see, or even what clusters you have in your kubeconfig or kubeconfigs. And this is also pretty useful too, say if maybe you need to jump between, like maybe you have a cluster on one cloud provider and you have your local one and you're trying to do testing on a bunch of different things, being able to just easily go and switch between the different ones and see what is there is pretty helpful. If you have your kubeconfig set to multiple files, then you can also see a bunch of the different ones there as well. So I'm just gonna stay on this one. If I did a kubeNS right now, I can see all the different namespaces that are available. If I were to create a namespace, and I'm just gonna call it hello. If I do kubeNS and just type hello, then I'm switching it to being in that namespace instead of having to do like a kubectl-n on every thing. Say if you're running like 5 different things in the same namespace, instead of having to do -n in that namespace over and over again, it can be pretty helpful with that. Okay. So you can also use kubectl wait on a bunch of other different things. So you could go and, for instance, go and create a deployment. So if I were to go and create that, and if I did a wait, probably should be there already since it's pretty fast, since I already had pulled Nginx before. But again, this is pretty useful for doing different types of testing, making sure that things are actually up. And if we just like went and looked at our deployments, we can see that we have that one up and running already. So there's just basically a bunch of different things out there. So you could also basically see what types of conditions can you wait on. So if I were to go to do it for my deployments, if I do a kget deployments and then -o, who here has used -o on JSON path before? Okay. So yeah, basically it helps a bunch so that you can just like specify like where in, I guess, like your JSON, or I mean, it's in the same place for YAML for a specific resource or a specific field. So, whoops. I'm still not used to having to, I added this thing that basically shows different commands I've run before, and I sometimes forget to hit the right button to actually have it fill that in. So basically we can see that we have two different things that we can wait on. We can wait on whether it's available or progressing. And if, depending on like what the resource is, it may have different types of conditions. It doesn't always show all of them, but this can help you figure out what you want to specifically wait on and what you can or can't wait on. So you can also go and do this for service as well. And then you can say, if I were to go and just like, expose, if I were to go and expose it, and then you can go wait on endpoints. So again, this is pretty fast since I just am creating a service for my hello, which is just my Nginx. So if I were to go to do that, then you can be like, hey, waiting for your service. But say if you were, and also there's this part here where it's like .IP. Since around like 128, basically you don't have to go and find the entire path of where something is located, which is super helpful for a JSON path. Sometimes it can be kind of annoying to try and figure that out. I'll show you a thing later that'll help you see where what the JSON path is for something if you don't know, instead of having to go and like traverse through the whole thing and find it. So you could also go and do this if you were doing it with a load balancer. It's a little bit different where you would go and wait for your endpoints, but then you're also going to wait for the service since you're specifically waiting for the external IP to be up and ready. So you can also do that for here. So there's a few important things to know about kubectl wait. So one, there is a default timeout, so that's 30 seconds. For instance, if your internet is super slow for some reason or whatnot, it can end up taking quite a while, and you might have to actually extend the wait period or it will just terminate. There's 0, where you basically go and just check once and then report whatever the status is. There's a negative value that for some reason you can wait an entire week. I'm curious if anyone has that as being useful, and you should tell me why you need an entire week to wait for something to be up. And then you can also do a kubectl wait and for something to be deleted as well. So who here has heard of either CAP or like the Carvel tool suite? Nobody. Okay, cool. So Carvel, sometime in the last couple of years, I kind of lost track of time at this point, ended up joining the CNCF. I'm not exactly sure what stage it is in right now, but Carvel.dev has a bunch of different tools. CAP is just one of them. There's also, which I'll show in a second, and then there's also YTT for like YAML templating, and there's a bunch of other things there as well. So if we go back over here, so like right now, if I was going and creating a resource with kubectl, you can go and see, it'll just basically say that, like say up at the top here, deployments.apps hello is created. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the deployment is actually ready. It just means that you went and created it. So one of the things with CAP is, one, if you don't do a -y for just yes, it will tell you what all operations it's trying to do. So for instance, hey, here's my deployment, here's my service, I'm trying to create it. It also goes and actually waits for all the different resources to be created. Then also it adds a label to everything that is being created with this app name. So for instance, say if you do a kubectl apply-f on a bunch of different files inside of the same namespace, pretend for some reason you forgot what all you applied and you decided, hey, I don't want anything running specific to this one app. Trying to maybe figure out how to go about deleting just the things for that can be sometimes a little bit complicated. So with this, it basically just adds, like there's an app for each time that you go and run something. So if we look at it again, I have -a and it's just called hello. So I could actually just go and do a delete on just that, and it'll get rid of everything that's specific to this one app that I ran, instead of trying to figure out everything or just have all the files for that. All right. Okay, so who has done anything with, in some capacity, which I will explain in a second, but turning off a deployment and turning it on again? Okay. So some of you may have seen this, but have you tried turning it off and on again? This has actually proven useful a few random times, not specific to Kubernetes, but just lately on this conference tour that I've been doing with my laptop or whatever else. I'm plugging it and plugging it back in. Even connecting to this earlier was not necessarily working. It was a little laggy. But yeah. So there's a few different ways to go about this. So one of the ways is with kubectl rollout. Who here has used or heard of kubectl rollout? Okay. So basically, you can do a kubectl rollout restart on your deployment. So if I were to go and do that, oops, wrong direction. So if I do that, we can see that it's restarted. If I do like get deployments, we can see that there's two things here. There's the one that I just created with cap. There is the one that I have hello. If we actually were to just, I'll show in a second when it's not using just the command line and having everything show up here. But so basically just to see kind of how it works, if we do a get deploy, hello, if we give it, look at our annotations, we can see that it added an annotation about when it's being restarted. So basically, this change ends up just triggering a rolling update. This doesn't, like it sort of turns it off and turns it on again, but you don't have any say as to when it comes back up. It's getting rid of it, and then you have a new one up and running. So if we looked at our pods, we can see that there's this one here that is 54 seconds old. So that's the one that just came up. So there's an actual way to turn things off and then on again. Who here has used kubectl scale? Okay. So yeah, basically, and who has scaled to 0 before? Probably the same hands. Okay. So if we were to just go over here, if we if we do a scale, okay, so I'm going to currently just leave that there. So if we actually take a look at our deployments, we can see that there are 0 ready. So why though? So there's a few different reasons. Maybe you want to turn off things that you don't specifically have in use. Maybe you want to do something specific with auto scaling. There's some challenges there. So with Kubernetes, auto scaling relies on things like CPU, memory utilization. And things are a little bit more complicated with front ends, but I don't really do much with front ends, so I can't go into completely why. So who here has heard of canines? Okay. The first person who told me about this had said it out as K9S. So for the longest time I was doing that, and then I saw the logo and I was just like, wait a second. So I had to get that one figured out. So if we look in the other direction, if we go over here, if we go to canines, basically instead of, hopefully that is somewhat legible. I don't know if I can actually make it. Yeah, I can make it a little bit bigger if it's not. Okay, so you're not using a full-on graphical UI, but it can make things be a little easier to dig into. So for instance, we can see here that it's orange for our hello, that there's 0 ready. If I were to go here and scale this up to say 3, and if we go back here, we can actually see that things aren't ready, and then things are going up and being ready. You can go and take a look into things further. You can see what the different pods are there. You can go and take a look into logs, et cetera. So basically, it just makes it, depending on how you like things, potentially easier to be able to dig into what is happening in your cluster. If you don't like going through this type of thing, but you like differentiating in colors, there is a tool out there called kubectl, for instance, and then you can also have colors or keep things as just the default, depending on what you like. Okay. So who here has generated some sort of YAML manifest in some way? Okay. Yeah, basically, since you're all here at a Kubernetes conference, you've at least touched it in some capacity, or at least know that there is a lot of YAML involved if you are dealing with Kubernetes. So if you are doing something like trying to study for and take the CCAT or the CKA exam or any of those, like they are time limited. So the faster that you can get things done, the better things are. You actually do get access to, last I checked, to the Kubernetes docs, but you don't have external websites, you don't have ChatGPT, which a lot of people like using nowadays. But so basically the question is, okay, so how can I go about creating YAML instead of having to go and actually do that? So one of the simpler ways is if you go and just do a kubectl create whatever the resource is, and if you do a -o YAML and then -o dry run equals clients, it will end up, instead of actually running and creating whatever resource it is, it'll give you the YAML for that. So if I go back over here, and I also like using YQ because, for me at least, I like having the color differentiation. Not everyone does, which is fine. So then basically we can see here that I have the entire YAML for what a deployment is. It throws in like the defaults as well. There's some plugins out there that you can use to get rid of those if you wanted to go and copy it down in a file and not have a bunch of things that you don't necessarily care about. So yeah, you can use that with kubectl run, you can use it with create, expose. There's just a bunch of different things there. And I thought that was super helpful when I was doing the CCAD. Okay, so who has used kubectl patch? Okay. So basically right now I just have nginx as my container name and my container image. So I could go and do a patch. Who here thinks, so right now I just have my name as nginx, I have my image as nginx. So who here thinks, I guess, that this will replace the image name and the image that's currently running? All right, who thinks that it will end up creating a second container and have that be running? All right, maybe I'm being confusing because I've seen one hand in both these, so I'll just go and show this in case it makes more sense just actually going and running it. So if we take a look here, if I do git deployment, and actually I just did, so if I get deployed, deploy. If I do that, if we look over here at our, let's see, where is my containers? So right now we can see that my image is just nginx, my name is nginx as well. If I do a patch, here, if we can also take a look over here. If I go back, if we take a look at hello, we can see that it's going and creating another container or another pod, and basically that we can see things are running here. One is trying to terminate, and then we actually end up having an error. So what ends up happening is if we take a look over here again, if we look at our YAML, we can see that there is actually now two images here, or containers. We have one with our nginx and one with the other one, because basically with this patch, it's checking to see what the name is, and then would try replacing the image based on that. So if I use the same image, then it would have fixed it or replaced it, whereas right now it's going and creating a second one, so it's something that you need to be careful about and watch for. And then it's failing because now it's trying to have two containers that are using port 80, which is not going to work out since they share the same network when they're running in the same pod. So to fix things like this, if you accidentally go and make a mistake, you could also use kubectl patch. As far as I'm aware, tell me later if I'm wrong in how to do it. You can't actually select an array item by the value at the moment, so but you can still go and remove it based on the location there. So if I were to go back over here, And then we could also take a look here. It starts terminating it, and then it'll end up just having one afterwards. So who here has heard of the fact that you can actually go and label columns? Okay, so basically, depending on what you're trying to go and like what you care about. So for instance, for me right now running on my kind cluster, all of my architectures, my instance types, all that stuff aren't so useful. I don't have different zones, I don't have different instance types, etc. But if there are specific things that you care about and want to look into, then you can go and set things that way. Also, if you hadn't noticed already, my talk mentioned that there were 11 tips and tricks, but due to this lovely thing called inflation, there are way more of them than that said. So, yeah. Okay, so you can also go and see like what controllers actually own your pods. So if we look over, go back here. So this is where we're going to be using custom columns. We can go and check like the owner kind and the owner name. So if we look here, we can see all the different ones that are created. We can see that all of our pods are specifically owned by replica sets, since well with Kubernetes, if you have a deployment, it creates a replica set and therefore ends up creating pods. So that can be potentially useful to figure out like what specifically owns something if you don't know. Okay, so instead of going about doing things like a patch, you could actually do a kubectl set. Who has heard of being able to use kubectl set? Okay, so I think this one is maybe one of the fewest I've seen so far. So basically there, and you don't have to go and like find specifically like where something might be located, et cetera. You could just do a kubectl set. So if I were to go and just do a kubectl set image on my deployment, and then I have Nginx, and then I can just change the image to Nginx Alpine. You could do this, say, with a service account. You have to be careful with some of these because, say, for instance, right now, I don't have a service account called my service account. If I were to go and change that on hello, or you can actually go and change it on, for instance, like all your deployments, it will actually go and make every single one of them fail because, well, it doesn't actually exist. You can also do things like setting like your resources. So like if I want to go and set like my CPU, my memory, and different things like that, you can go and just like, there's also kubectl set env, and then you can like see different things there. And some combinations of things don't necessarily work, so you might have to play around a little bit to figure out what you can or can't do there. So if I were to just like look over here, oops. And then if we were to get the deployment again and look at the YAML, we can see that it went and changed it, and we only have one container in this pod, which is good. Okay. So it's pretty important if you're dealing with something like with role-based access control. So you can go in, for instance, use kubectl auth to list what permissions you have. So if we go back over here, oh my gosh. Okay, so it might be kind of hard to see things based on how the screen is. It'll be easier if you run this on your own machine. But basically, you can go and see what permissions you have. So for instance, right now, there's this star where basically I have access to everything since I can, this is my cluster. I'm not logged in, I'm not using some other like user or whatnot, so I can do whatever I want. But if you're trying to like check to see if, say, I have access as someone else, that can be pretty useful too. So if I were to do, okay, auth, can I list? And then you can do as, and then for instance, I could check as like kube scheduler, what do I have access to be able to do? We can see that you can do like create on different things, but I can't do like I can't go and delete every single thing that I want everywhere. So again, that can be quite useful and important when you're like trying to give a certain person permissions and then verifying that you actually gave them the permissions that you think you did. There's some other plugins and tools out there that you can add to kubectl to do this type of thing as well. So just kind of checking into that. Okay, so there is, for if you're trying to do a type of watch, you can also do a -- output watch events. So if I were to go back over here, so you can see a little bit more information. If I were to go and do a roll, oops, I'll just exit out of here. Okay. And then you can go and actually see that things are creating and terminating and seeing that here something is being added or things are being modified and just a little bit more information there. So earlier I was mentioning JSON path. Sometimes you want to know what the JSON path is. Who's heard of cron before? Okay, nobody. Cool. Finally. So we can use cron to basically figure out what the JSON path of something is. So if I were to go over here, I'm going to terminate that. So if I wanted lookup pressure, for instance, you can see that it's under like status, conditions, and then type and different things like that. So you can figure out where something is located if you need to specifically have the JSON path for some reason for something. So who's heard of Nixery? A couple of people, okay. So for instance, say you're testing something out and instead of wanting to go and do like, here, let me go create this Dockerfile, I'm gonna start with some specific base image, and then I'm going to do like a apt-get install on like, for instance, I need kubectl, I need curl, I need JQ. Having to go and create a like Docker image every single time that you want to do something like that can be kind of annoying. So there's this thing called Nixery. You can just go to nixery.dev. But basically, for most different tools, or at least a good chunk of the tools that you may end up wanting to use, you just separate it with a slash. And so, for instance, I have shells. Since I want to be able to actually run something, I want kubectl curl JQ, and it will create, like, start up a container with having all those things that are in there. So if I go to the other direction. So if I just do like a Docker run, for instance, if I did like curl on like example.com, for instance, you can see that I already have curl in there. So that can be pretty useful as well. Okay, so there are some caveats. So by default, the images are AMD 64. You can do ARM64. You just need to go and add that in the front. Currently, there aren't multi-arc images. And so there's another thing that I forgot to go and add in here, but who's heard of kubectl explain? Okay, so if we exit out of here, so if we do explain on, say, if I want a deployment. So with this, you can see what the different fields are. Like, one, what is a deployment? Two, you can see what the different fields are. And if you're trying to figure out like where something is located, you could do a -- recursive, and this basically gives you every single field that is possible in your YAML or JSON for whatever resource type that is, which also can be pretty helpful for like some of the CCAT exams, since it'll be like, hey, please add this thing to the YAML, and if you don't know where something is located in there, that can be a little confusing, so you can do it with this. And if you do a K API or kubectl API resources, also, I'm sorry, this looks really weird since I was trying to make sure the font is legible, but you can, for instance, see what the API version of something is and where it's located. So for instance, we can see that our daemon sets are in apps v1, so that can also be pretty helpful as well. So yeah, thanks for coming and listening. Again, I forgot, I guess it's not on this slide, but if going back to this one, if you want to look at the slides afterward, you can just go to that QR code and pull that up. And so, yeah, I don't know if there are, okay. So I guess what's the best way of me finding out what the question is?
I can read it for you, don't worry. Isn't it easier to just use kubectl edit than create a separate definition for patch?
Yeah, so you can definitely do that. Sometimes if you do something a little funny with your spaces or whatnot, which I have done a number of times using Vim, for instance, it will just end up, like you could do that if you aren't screwing things up like me sometimes. But sometimes, again, with like YAML with spaces, for instance, it actually matters. Or just like if you copy and pasted something in and like the formatting is a little bit weird, it will just fail and not actually edit it. So it kind of just depends on what you prefer doing. Yeah. So like edit, if you're just like playing around with something, then yeah, that's useful. But yeah, doing like, for instance, yeah, with pipelines and whatnot, you can't have it do that. You can't just put that into some sort of bash script and have it do the edit. So.
Is there any other question?
Cool. Well, thank you, and have a good rest of the conference.
Thank you.